Hello and welcome to another episode of the Data Revolution podcast. And today my guest is Peter Evans-Greenwood. Welcome, Pete. It's great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Did you want to introduce yourself and what are we going to talk about today?
So I suppose the nutshell history of me is I started off in AI research, stumbled my way into a few startups, ended up in industry, and for the longest time, about 10 or 12 years, I ran research at Centre for the Edge for Deloitte Australia. So this is kind of think tankish, where it was really semi-academic research where we were looking at how's the world changing the way that matters to customers. And since then, I've kind of moved on and I'm doing that sort of independently in industry. And my kind of real interest is not so much the technology, because I was deep in the technology, as understanding how it changes work and workplace and society around us, because a lot of it's kind of very non-intuitive. And I find there's a lot of really interesting models out there that help you understand what's happening, but they tend not to come out of the technology. One of my favorite things at the moment is there's a somewhat obscure researcher, Damer, who studied how we create knowledge and how we create tools. And he's famous for looking at Babylonian tablets and stuff like that, and the invention of zero. And his big point was we don't invent tools and then bring them to the work. So we don't have theoretical ideas and then work out how to apply them. It actually goes the other way. And what happens is material practice generates these new things. So rather than tool to work, it's work to tool or work to idea. And he's got a couple of great examples. One is the invention of the concept of zero. How the concept of zero wasn't something that someone had an idea in a bathtub. It came out of the practicalities of trying to manage accounting in Babylonian tablets. And it's another great one he talks about is Galileo's invention of pendulum motion and the Cantor hanging chain, which again, there's a fascinating paper he wrote where he shows how it didn't come out of some brilliant insight. It was more adapting ideas and practices around him and pushing them just that little bit further until they break. And that's kind of really interesting for the current moment. So if you look at what's happening with AIs, everyone's running around saying, we've got this magical tool, how do I apply it everywhere? And what Damo tells us, we're kind of doing this backwards, in that what we should be doing is looking at the work and trying to understand how we want the work to evolve and where it can help, rather than trying to say we should reorganize all the workflows, it will happen eventually. But the more important thing is to understand how the work itself.
I think that's a really interesting angle to look at, because I wrote a blog post recently where I was sort of contemplating the AI jobs apocalypse, because everybody's running around with their hair on fire. We're all going to lose our jobs and stuff. And I was like, every other technology revolution that we've had, a bunch of people have lost their jobs and a lot of them haven't been able to retrain. It's very bad to be the people in that transitional era, but a lot more jobs emerge as the technology sort of solidifies into the world.
That's how the economists kind of frame it when they're coming top down. And it's kind of true. It's when James Baldwin did a great book called Learning by Doing, where he talks about a lot of this, and he pointed out that so the peak population of weavers was actually in the 1970s. He didn't put the weavers out of work. It changed what it meant to be a weaver, and the addressable market grew. So we needed more weavers. And it was only when kind of demand was saturated that we stopped creating weavers. And you can see the same thing. One of my favorite examples is signwriting. So if you look at signwriting in the 70s, it was some dude with a stick, with a knob on the end and a paintbrush, because it was all hand lettering. And then you look at signwriting today, and I don't know if people realize it, but the person who's wrapping your car, if you're going to get that nice sparkly finish on your car, is a signwriter. And there's actually a line between those, which is fairly obvious when you dig into it, because if you look into the 90s, you go, so signwriting was a trade about going to talk to a shop and understanding what they wanted and then painting the stuff on the window or on the chalkboard or whatever it is. We invented desktop publishing and vinyl cutters. You look at old vinyl cutters at about the same time, in the kind of the mid-90s. And some signwriters worked out that you could use this to make not as good signs, but much cheaper signs. And what a lot of people really wanted wasn't a hand-painted sign. They just wanted something with the current price on it. And so the technology developed and signwriting developed. And the bits of the craft that we used to value, so the holding the stick and being able to write all the letters, kind of fell away. But other bits of it strengthened. So it's kind of like understanding of the brief, or being able to get the brief out of the person, negotiating with clients, all that stuff got much more important. And signwriting evolved over 20 or 30 years, so it became more sticking stuff on, and then once they worked out you could stick your stuff on different things, and that's how we got to wrapping cars. And if you look at a lot of... And so if you look at a lot of professions, that's kind of the path you go on. You don't really displace people. What you do is you tend to reconfigure the job. So the first thing that happens there is is we tend to talk about jobs in terms of tasks and knowledge, like they're the stable things of units of analysis. And if you look at a lot of the economists who do predictions of job exposure or technology exposure, they do it by breaking a job into a series of tasks, then mapping the task to a technology and saying, well, if this is a close alignment, then there's lots of exposure. But the problem is if you look at what happens when you introduce a new technology to a job, you don't automate a task. You actually redistribute everything. All the tasks change because you've got a new technology that works a different way. And this could be something as simple as putting a memory aid on a speed indicator in a plane, where all of a sudden the role of the pilot changes and who remembers speeds changes. And so those task-based kind of impact measures have a very bad track record because they're not actually measuring how the impact works. And because you get this evolving role thing happening that we saw with signwriters. I think that you still need to acknowledge that there's some jobs that get eliminated, like I think one of the famous ones is elevator attendants.
One of my first jobs in IT was getting rid of the typing pool, automating letter generation in an insurance company, and a lot of those people didn't find another job because they were at a stage in their life where they, didn't have a lot of options. So yes, that's what I'm saying. It's kind of bad if you're in that transitional group.
If you're in the transitional phase, and the other problem is this might be happening faster, so the transitional phase is going to get a bit harder. Things that we should worry about, but they become. I think they're not new worries, and they're problems we're already dealing with. Like one of the horrifying stats I've been carrying around for a while is the fastest growing homeless population is single women over 55. Usually divorced because they haven't had a job for a while, so they've got a career gap. They're on their own for the first time. It's just about impossible to get. And this is the sort of thing that we're going to be dealing with, which we're already dealing with badly. We need to do better, but it's not a new thing. And so when I'm looking at will it change your job? Absolutely. Will it automate your profession out of existence? Probably not. Will it compress and change what you do? And I think I'm working with lawyers a bit, and it's interesting that they've worked out that what the current way of AI does is compress execution a lot. So you can go and get a draft fairly quickly. I mean, you've got to worry about hallucinations. There's a whole bunch of issues there. But it's a great kind of tool from once you know what to do. And it kind of creates this Jeffrey Koons moment, the bloke who makes the big balloon animals out of aluminium, where he's never made his art. So he's a world-famous artist, Squillians, has never made his own art. He's always contracted it out. And I saw an interesting interview with him years ago where he was talking about, so he cares a lot about capturing his intent and ensuring quality. Does he actually get what he wanted? And he was talking about, in the interview, he was talking about how he very early on he started using Pantone colors to specify every color. It was the only way, because Pantone colors have there's a kind of a rich tool set behind it to map to different surfaces to make sure you get exactly what you want. And that's happening with lawyers and other professions at the moment, where when you compress execution, it doesn't mean that you're going to have a job apocalypse, because there's a couple of dynamics there. The first one is the thing that determines what your clients spend is not your cost. I find that most clients want to do more than they can afford, and so all you're doing is going to let them deal with some of the backlog. So that they'll reach further down the to-do list and find something that's more impactful.
And that's something a couple of people have said to me about this is you go further down the to-do list rather than
you clear more of your backlog.
Yeah.
The second one is there's a lot of implicit Q&A that used to happen in execution that doesn't happen anymore. So you're going to have a quality problem. So you've got to spend a lot more time on capturing intent and making sure you get what you want. So that the high level skills. And then you've got a bunch of the standard problems that I remember when I was starting out. You talk to CIOs who'd been through the early phases of outsourcing, and they said, well, everyone made the same mistake at the start. They said, I can lose the bottom half of the pyramid because I can outsource all of that. But then where does your next generation of leadership come from? So then they started taking a slice down the side, so that you had someone sure, so you had the leadership. And we appear to be making the same mistake again with AI, where people say, I can get rid of all the bottom half of the triangle. It's like, you don't want to do that. And this is why.
Make the same mistakes. I was at a meeting with a large company today, and they've outsourced their executive assistants to offshore.
Virtual
executive assistants don't know their building or the rooms, and they booked a room that didn't exist. So we were traipsing around the building looking for a room, forlornly. It was really funny. And, he was just like, oh, yeah, we've outsourced this now. So, it's and the problem you get is you lose the immediacy of the person knowing the context. And I think we're starting to see with AI, context is everything, or at least a lot.
Context has always been everything. I remember a while ago I was working on voice interfaces for voice portals, and you always saw the pictures, and you watched Star Trek, and you had the computer, and you very quickly work out it's really hard to work out how to capture any sort of context to make that work, because it's not a person. It's only got these bits and pieces of data. This is partly why voice struggle with so much. They're just not contextually aware. And it's why when you're using a language model, managing context or building context is possibly more important than prompting, because it determines how the thing responds more than what you actually say to it. We kind of undervalue that, and we assume there's an assumption that context is just unstated propositional knowledge. I could write it down if I wanted to, but you can't. It's like I was talking to some people in retail, and they've got this nirvana idea that you're going to get this AI bot that's going to shop for you. I can't work out how to make it work because. So you want a jumper. What do you tell the bot? Shopping's a journey where you don't actually really have an intent half the time, and you don't really know what you want to buy until you see it most of the time. So how do I capture that? And
Well,
the answer is you can't.
and and there are different kinds of shoppers because I've got experience in retail and distribution, and there are some people who are mission based who want to go straight to the pink jumper on the rack and take that and buy that. And there are people who like to meander through a mall and
Be
wander around
inspired.
and look at stuff. Don't really have a specific intention to buy, but do buy. So
Sometimes, yeah.
there's different and that context. How do you explain that context? In the mood for wandering, I might buy.
Well, you don't know until this is the thing. It's a lot of your knowledge is not unstated propositional knowledge. I could express my preferences given a big enough. I mean, this is the problem you have with selling planning for your retirement. The first question is, what does happy retirement look like? And you have no idea, other than you want it to be happy. And you can't express it. And because you can't express it, and you're kind of guessing, and this is the thing that your entire retirement planning hinges on. It's you're stumbling at the first hurdle because you literally just don't know. You can't express that. There's no way of expressing it. And
It's
so
really because I tried to retire and then I realized I don't have any hobbies.
all your hobbies are things you do for work,
Yeah, I get paid for the things I enjoy doing.
or you just do them anyway. Like I started thinking I might write a new book, so I started a Substack stuff. I think by writing, so I write stuff and I put it on the Substack, and now it's trundling along and slowly picking up subscribers. And I'm like, would I be doing this if I wasn't working? Well, probably. I mean, is it work? I suppose it is, and it's resulting in me doing stuff, but it's kind of hard to articulate. So when you look at the job apocalypse, I think it's not the best we can say about AI language models as they stand today is they're definitely a deflationary tool like a nail gun. Nail guns came along in I think it was the 60s, and all of a sudden we slashed 60 or 70 cost out of frame and the cost out of framing in your house, which is great because framing costs a bit of money, but it only moved the price of the house by about 10% because it's not a general tool. It was framing, and it didn't really affect the industry at all other than houses got very slightly cheaper and we built slightly more complicated houses. And there's lots of data that AI behaves like that in a lot of businesses. So if you can find, if you're drafting a document or you're doing some research or you're in that sort of textual area where it's really good at, it'll have a huge boost, but it doesn't help elsewhere. Even the data have to take that as proof. The open question is AI platform like containerization or electrification? And we actually have lots of anecdotes. We have the J curve and we have the solos, lag and all that sort of stuff. But none of them are predictive. They're all descriptive of past things. So we actually don't know whether that's going to happen. And a lot of the job apocalypse is predicated on that. And we just have no data for it.
The other interesting thing that I think that I'm seeing emerging is a lot of people now thinking of AI as plumbing, as infrastructure. So, it's kind of replacing the server. It's an ecosystem that is replacing the three-tier application architecture that was traditional. So that's how it's happening in a lot of people's mind. But I don't think it's been joined up with what you do with it. And one of the things that people often come to my AI for innovation classes and say is, I don't know what to do with AI. And I think we're still in that bit of the AI journey.
Yes, and kind of no. I mean, this is kind of you can only really use a technology when it changes and when your material conditions change so that it makes sense. Like there's a great example in a book called by Rosenberg put in the book Thinks Inside the Black Box. And his argument is economists to look at how technologies work and how they at the details rather than stat high level stats. And he has a great example of how they developed this wonder seed in some area of the US. And it was wonderful where it worked, bigger yields, lower bugs, all sorts of good stuff. It didn't work a state over because there's a whole bunch of contextual stuff that the technology had to change to work with, and it was different soil conditions, different climate, which we weren't aware of when we tried to move it. So to a certain extent, you're fighting that. It's not so much about people need time to learn as we need to adapt the technology and the conditions need to change. And even then, it's interesting that we tend to rush at this anthropomorphic, its intelligence, which I don't know is helpful because it's a real language models are really
Calling it
powerful tools.
artificial intelligence was branding. Technologists never do proper branding. The
No,
same
of
as
course they
data
don't.
governance. Stupid words.
But so you look at like some of the, like I'm not sure about the infrastructure. It's not that it is infrastructure, but it's clear that, and we saw this a few years ago. I think IBM GSA did that thing where they said they're going to move a lot of their back office to language models to what we call agentic AI now, and they spent a whole bunch of money, and it sort of worked, and they walked it back a bit. That was a mess, but there were some really clear success signals out of that. So I remember I was talking to someone there saying that one of the things they automated was changing a reporting line in the business, which you can imagine it used to be ring up your HR rep, you talk to them, they'd work out who needs to be looped in, emails would go and they'd work at it for a week or two and then eventually it would happen. And in the future state, what they got to, it was you fire up the chatbot, you talk to it, it sends a bunch of emails, 2 hours later it's done. And that's kind of interesting from a few levels. The first thing, that's clearly nail gun. And for that particular task, it's wonderful. But let's be honest, if you can eliminate 80% of your HR department in a company of, it was IBM GSA, 5,000 people, it's not really going to move the needle at all. But I mean, from a productivity point of view of the people using it, it's great. But the more interesting one is something we've struggled with for a couple of decades at least since probably the 90s, is how do you integrate systems? We started off with simple point-to-point stuff, and we got kind of better at it. We did category management, but we still struggle with a lot of how do you map that messy stuff across systems?
Yep.
Because it's really hard to make an API. And the answer is you don't. You use a language model and just uses the human interfaces. Problem solved. So you can see part of the SaaS apocalypse, as they call it, is you don't need a complicated interface on your systems of record anymore. You need something simple that lets you get the basics done, and anything complicated will be done by a language model because it'll work it out.
Yeah.
And that's going to be huge because you can make you so much more productive. So I think that's the AI's infrastructure. But I think the other thing people aren't realizing is we're still thinking too much in terms of tasks. Like one of my favorite ones is everyone's worried about AI slop. With writing, you shouldn't use AI to write. And I find that kind of really weird because when you're writing, you don't have a set of discrete tasks that you oscillate between that some could be done with AI. It's that kind of Dana point again. You pull in different tools and you change your style of writing and how you go about it because the whole practice changes. And years ago, I adopted Scrivener, which is a very index card type writing tool. And I've got a very nonlinear writing process where it's all about collecting ideas and rebuilding the narrative constantly until you get the whole thing works. So I pulled a language model into that, and my first use was I'm not getting it to write or to brainstorm. I'm getting it to help me herd my index cards around and critique them and pull them apart and work out where the holes are and explore options. And it works really, really well. It's not clear it's doing any of the tasks, but the big thing for me was partway through that, I think last year, I worked out that I found a reference that it had possibly hallucinated, which is fine because I assume all of its stuff's rubbish and you might have to get rid of it. But I realized it was Peter Damer actually. I realized it was a real researcher doing a real thing. So what the language model had done is it had said, these concepts you're playing with, there's a natural connection here that looks like this, and you haven't explored it. And I had no way of finding it. And it was interesting because what I'd kind of done is, if the language model is kind of sedimented human experience, all of human experience, so it's not like a person in that it can see everything, but there's no agency there. It pushed back in a way that gave me new insight, which was foundational for some of the other stuff I was doing. And so you've got this new thing coming up as well. And we're not really thinking in terms of we're thinking in terms of how can I do what I'm doing faster rather than what new capability. And I think one of the concrete ways of thinking about that is everyone's talking about generating text with language models. No one's talking about using them to do close reading for you. And they're actually really good at it. They're really good at picking apart an argument and showing where the holes and where the rhetorical moves are. And take your favorite vendor white paper and get the language model to pull it apart and show you how the evidence hangs together. And it's brutal because there's no social conventions there about being nice.
Well, especially if you're not using one of the more sycophantic models, and you've told it not to be nice. I think you kind of hit on an interesting thing there in that we're kind of all stuck in the making processes more efficient bucket for AI. That's what we're all, because that's all the low-hanging fruit. That's if I remove the friction from this process and automate it, I can save some money and my customer gets a better experience. So we're all sort of glommed onto that now. And the thing that we're not trying to think about is all the new things like that kind of thing. And what are the emergent properties of AI that we can use in new ways? So I think that's a really interesting.
And that's actually kind of really interesting because so you take the whole SaaS apocalypse and everyone's saying AI is disrupting. They're going to replace the user interfaces. They're going to become systems of record. This is disruptive for their pricing because what happens when you get rid of seats? How do they price? So they're all going through that. But what people aren't realizing is we've spent since the mid-90s, tech has pretty much been processes. We went from the 80s where we had isolated systems. In the 90s we started integrating them. We had category management and stuff like that. And that kind of finished in around the late 2010s, maybe 2017, 2018 when SAP put out HANA. And all our processes are optimized. There's not really any way of making them go faster. There's marginal improvements at best. What's fascinating is you can actually see where the next thing to do is because over that 30-year journey, we've unbundled firms. Firms are now smaller than they've ever been in terms of headcount. I love talking about like the Australian super funds, Australian super in particular. But it's about 2,000 people, which puts it on the upper end of small to medium business. But it's parking somewhere like 500 to 600 mil a week, which puts it in ginormous.
Yeah.
And so the revenue is huge, but the firm's relatively small because everything's externalized. And so what you're finding is there are no processes to optimize in a firm like that, because everything's kind of already in the right system and it's done. What's happening is costs are accumulating at the boundaries between institutions in terms of exceptions. And my favorite example is if you look at retail returns. I think retail returns is 20 or 30% of costs now. It's material, it's huge. And the only thing we're really doing to try and solve the problem is use AI to absorb the returns more effectively. So it's failure demand. This demand shouldn't exist. Maybe we can do it a bit better. And you can see the solution in the start of with category management. The interesting thing about category management is we talk about the PC and the internet and technology, but it really wasn't, there wasn't any technology in category management. It was the realization that when you've got two firms working together, neither of them can work out what the optimum shelf is. The retailer can see the shelf and the supplier can see the market. But to optimize the shelf, you've got to see the shelf and the market.
Yeah.
And so what they did is they moved the decision from inside the retailer to the boundary between the retailer and the supplier. And we invented a whole practice with category management. And if you go into Coles or a Woolies or somewhere, a big retailer, you'll find category management teams who are populated by suppliers. And that's kind of the move we need to do. If you look at the problems with retail returns, it's partly defective products, it's partly supply chains, it's partly people doing things like showrooming. They're going to the prom, so they buy 5 dresses, wear one, send them all back. And the problem with trying to drive those costs out is no one in the ecosystem can see the cost. They can't see enough of the ecosystem, just like category management, to solve the problem. So the solution is to move something to the boundary and do something different, which probably will involve AI, but it's a bit like category management. It's not driven by the technology. So you can sort of see, if you look around the industry, you can see these costs from exception management everywhere, and that's the next big thing. But yeah, it's to do something about that, you've got to start moving away from this idea that I take the technology and I apply it to say, well, I've got an environment, I've got all these tools. Where are the opportunities in my ecosystem?
It's interesting to think about using techniques like Wardley mapping or something to visualize the future, some visual ways to think about the future rather than just waiting for it to happen to people.
I don't know. I mean, they're useful tools for optimizing, but are they the right tool to help you see the future? The problem with the future is that you tend not to be able to see it until it arrives. So like no one who was in the putting out system of the Industrial Revolution could see factories coming until they were there. If you go back to Daimler and the invention of zero, no one predicted the invention of zero. You literally can't see it. And if you want to equate that to business, you can look at something like, so Starbucks had margins collapse last year. So for years, they've been in the third place. They can charge twice what anyone did for a fairly straightforward drink. And they spent a decade or two optimizing incremental revenue. We've got a kitchen, so we'll put drive-through because it's out of the same kitchen, and we're going to get more money at the till, so we'll put buns next to the coffees, and then we'll make more complicated drinks. And what they found is they destroyed the thing that created the value, the third place. It was no longer a third place. And it's kind of like the concept of zero. If you look at the way operations are arranged, the countable thing, the thing that you could put in a Wardley map, the sort of thing that's got defined boundaries, isn't the thing that created the value for them. It was this unquantifiable third place idea, which sounded good, but wasn't measured. And because they couldn't measure it and they couldn't build it into their IKOs and their strategies and all that stuff, it implicitly wasn't valued and so it was eaten up by everything else. And this is also the Blockbuster story, because Blockbuster could see it.
It's
That's
really
sort of coming.
it's really interesting because we're doing some thinking at my day job about impact analysis, which is kind of that kind of problem. But how do you know all of those intangibles that are driving impact? You know, like you've got all the dashboards and stuff and you measure the numbers, but how do you craft knowledge of those intangibles? And we were having a conversation literally just before we recorded this, myself and a couple of colleagues talking about, well, how can we create a narrative structure that can start to elicit some of these things?
Oh, this is the stuff my book's about. So there's some really obvious moves you can do to help. So the first one is you have to admit to yourself that data is, even though you're using data for prediction, data is inherently backwards looking.
Mm.
Because the data is framed in terms of yesterday's assumptions. So what you're doing is predicting the past into the future, and the future is not necessarily the same. Because sometimes, again, when we had the putting out system, no one could predict from extrapolating anything that the factory system was going to emerge. And no one predicted in the 90s that category management was going to be a thing, because it's back to that idea that we tend to think tool to work when it's work to tool. And the reason is that the tool that's going to change everything is not even thinkable until
someone thinks it.
no, it's not. It's even more fundamental. It's not thinkable until the material conditions change in such a way that they support thinking that concept. And a great example is electrification, where the economists will talk about a 30-year lag before we reorganise, and that was organisational learning. But if you look at what actually happened bottom up, then the reason we invented unit drive when we did is because before that, it just didn't make any sense. It just wasn't a concept that we could hold in our head. Think about the Industrial Revolution and steam engines. When prior to steam, if you're starting a mill, you don't consider where you're going to put the mill. You don't go, should I put it in your customers or should I put it in your suppliers? Where should I put it? You go, put it next to a river, because that's what you do, because that's where power comes from. And you can sort of see the thought process. So steam emerged in the coal mines where fuel was free, because it's the only place it made sense.
I think that was a really good post that you wrote. I'm going to share that in the show notes.
Oh, that one. That's quite punchy.
Yeah.
Steam emerged there because fuel was free and they had a problem that you couldn't solve any other way, in that they had to pump water out of the mines or people drowned. You had to pump 24/7. Horses didn't work. Humans didn't work. You couldn't use wind or water because they were unreliable. So they needed something else. And so that's why the steam engine emerged there. And we kept improving the steam engine. And it hit a point where it made sense to not have the steam engine anywhere next to the fuel, because it was efficient enough. Because the first steam engines would have eaten your entire margin if you tried to put them anywhere else. And the actual innovation wasn't the steam engine, it was the logistics network that would deliver coal anywhere. Yeah. Once you had the logistics network, and you can just see it, so you've got a couple of mills, and the water's driving you nuts. You know, the river freezes in winter, and the power varies. It's causing problems. There's this new steam engine, and I can get the coal. So okay, I'll put that in. And the next time you're trying to place a mill, you're going to say, okay, I'm going to place a mill. Where should I? Which river? Oh, actually, I don't need to put it next to a river anymore, do I? Because I'm not using the water power. Yeah. Where should I put it? And that's when the idea of, well, I should put it next to workforce or customers. It literally wasn't thinkable until that moment. And it's the same with unit drive, in that when we had steam factories, you had a mechanical power transmission, and the big machines had to go at the short end of the shaft with high power, and the little machines away from it. And that's how you factor in. This is not a constraint that you acknowledge. It's the shape of the world. And it was only as electric power transmission improved. So you started an extra factory next year. So rather than buy another steam engine or move mechanically, you bought a second electrical engine. So now you've got two electrical engines, and you've got electrical power transmission on your premises. Then you might do a third, and then you're going to redo this factory, and you go, well, actually, what if I use the transmission inside the factory? And all of a sudden, a thought that wasn't thinkable before has become thinkable. And that's what I mean by it's work to tool. It's when the conditions of the work evolve to the point that you can think this new thing. That's when you get the transmission. And what's really interesting is that we wonder why we get this huge booms of technologies diffusing. It's not the technology that's diffusing, because the material conditions for this idea, like a unit drive to emerge, are happening everywhere all at once. So when it emerges, it doesn't emerge in one place. It emerges kind of everywhere all at once. And you get this huge wave. It's not about one person having an idea and it transmitting. It's about a community of practitioners suddenly realizing that they can do something differently and then all starting to do it.
And I
And that's what we're waiting for AI.
I think it's already starting to emerge with people doing the kind of thing that you said with your writing, where you're using it to challenge, you using it to pick things apart. There's a huge number of people that I talk to who are using it for exactly that. And there's a huge number of people who very much disapprove of that use.
So I see that as gatekeeping, and it's
Yeah.
happened in the past. If you want the stereotype, if you go back to, there's a book called Leviathan and the Air Pump, written by two blokes whose names start with S, so I can't remember their names. And it's about Boyle and the start of the Royal Society. And what we think of the scientific method it was a political response to try and create knowledge in a world where the sovereign was losing power and the church was losing power. We needed something separate. And so they had this idea of witnessed experiments. And it was all about the gentleman and the witnessing, and all about maintaining control.
Control, yeah.
And it's about building a new institution. And what you're seeing at the moment is the people who bleat the most about that tend to be the credentialed people at the institutions with the most to lose. And what I find interesting is the minute you start using, so the first thing you'll do is you'll start using language models to help you draft something because it's useful. Then you'll use them to start challenging your own writing. Where's the holes in my argument? How do I improve this? And then you'll realize you can do that to someone else's argument. So you can get an essay someone else wrote instead of saying, where are the holes in this? Where does it stand up? Where are the problems? And then you'll realize that a lot of the publications which have big mastheads are slop. So they've got editors and they've got credentialed people working really hard to make them fluent and have that sheen. But the arguments are terrible. There's nothing to them. And that's one of those aha moments in which I think we're rapidly approaching. People are starting to realize that we were worried about AI slop, but we actually have a human slop problem as well, because once you start using these tools to amplify your ability to understand and navigate narratives, the first thing you question is your own writing, then you start questioning other people's writing, and then you realize, and I saw a post today on this pointing out that if you look at there was a news article the other day that was that ArchiveX is requiring you to stand by all your citations.
Uh-huh.
And the pushback on that's hilarious, because you go, well, you should have always have.
Like, you can check their citations.
And there's people saying, I can't do that. It's not possible. And I'm like, but why are you citing it then? And what it's exposing
like,
is
citing something you haven't read, because, that's
so
supposed to do that.
So we're kind of at this phase where people are starting to realize that that there's a lot of stuff out there that actually isn't very good, even though it looks professional.
Yeah. So what we're starting to see is the weakness that's inherent in the systems that we've already got. We're uncovering that because of the conversations around AI, which is a really interesting challenge.
I mean, the nutshell version of it is assessments at universities. When I was teaching at Swinburne and then RMIT, for over 10 years, we've had a problem with, you can pay services to give you an outline for an essay, for an assignment.
Yeah, on the back of the toilet door, you tear them off.
Yeah, and they weren't expensive. It was like $20-$50 per essay. And I know these were being submitted to me. I was being asked to mark them. And because you get I used to have a hurdle exam in one of my subjects, and you could pick the people who hadn't written any of their assignments because they couldn't put two words. I mean, I made the hurdle like 10%, so it's not going to hurt your overall mark. You can get 41% and pass the subject if you in an exam and pass. But you had to show that you had some grasp of the material.
You had to show that you'd read something. And
a surprising number of people didn't, and then AI come along, and all it's done is it's taken that $50 an assignment to $50 a month for as many assignments as you can do. So it's not the problem, and that's what I think a lot of the noise at the moment is. It's people realizing that there was actually a lot of problems in how we evaluate students, the material coming out of institutions with big brands, and we didn't realize those problems were there. And it's not that AI is creating them, it's highlighting it.
I've talked about this with a number of guests, and the thing that we kind of need to work out is, what is the nugget of knowledge someone actually needs to know, and what is the knowledge that they need to be able to look up and know exists, which is kind of the difference between an open book and a closed book exam.
So I look at, like, if you just have to my own practices, if you look at how I write now, over the last 10-ish years, I've gone from a fairly linear, traditional, you open up Word and start writing, to a very non-linear, index card facilitated by technology, and then integrating AI into that. So if you were to put me into an exam and say, write an essay on this, I'd be trying to work out how to adapt all the practices that I've developed that I'm used to using
Yeah, I know.
to this and you kind of go, what are you measuring here? You're not measuring my ability to craft an argument. What you're doing is you're measuring my ability to craft an argument using 1950s technology.
Well, the whole argument against closed book exams is you're just testing memory, you're not testing understanding. And I say that as a person with ADHD who has terrible short-term memory. So, I can't remember anything.
I have no
So,
short-term memory. I'm
yeah.
terrible at it.
So we kind of suffer from that. It's interesting to think about how we're going to have to evolve these kind of practices in the future.
Well, this is me quoting Damo again, where his attitude would be, or if you Hutchins with his how Cockpit remembers at speed is the same. We talk about you need to learn the underlying research skills before you can apply them with the new technology. And what that's really saying is you should learn how to do this with old technology, which requires different practices because it works differently, before you can learn to do it with new technology, which is different practices because it works differently, which is just nonsensical. It's just like, so can I use index cards in the exam? Well, what can I use? Well, because we don't think in our heads, we think by interacting with the world around us. And the ability for me to take ideas and put them on an index card and then arrange them, and then use a tool like Scrivener to let me do that at much more scale and search for and have more index cards and explore more options. And AI does that again. It amplifies it again. Asking me to write an essay without those tools is asking me to not, what are you measuring?
Yeah,
And I remember field theory at university, where field theory is a subject where all the exams are open book. More to the point, you can take anything you want into the field theory exam. They did not care. It didn't help. It was
the thing is, if you've got a finite time period to complete an exam and it's open books, you can bring anything in. If you don't know where to find it and you don't know what's in your materials, you can't do the exam. So that's I think a fairer test. But I've done many a closed book exam, and because that was my husband's a high school mathematics teacher, and when AI came out, he's like, oh well, we just go back to lock him in a room and lock the door and just not let them have any stuff. So we he's locked them in a room to test their knowledge.
and you can see why that's the natural reaction because it's protecting the existing practices. But it's also possibly the wrong response. Like I did a thing at Centre for the Edge. We did it with the creativity researchers on should everyone learn how to code. This kind of ran for 10 years. And we started off roundtables because we were just trying to work out should everyone learn how to code. For me, it didn't make any sense. I came out of AI research and I'd walk around somewhere like Deloitte Digital and going, what they call coding is not what I've ever done. It's very different. So let's work it out. And we worked out pretty quickly that what employers and parents were saying is that we've got a bunch of kids who are coming out and they seem to have all these skills for digital tools that we've taught them. But if you give them a problem, they don't know what to do. And there was one guy who ran a company somewhere in Geelong. He said it brilliantly. He said, look, you've got a new hire and they've got the degree and all the bits and pieces. You give them a problem that you think they should be able to solve because it reuses tools that they already know and they should be able to smash it together and work it out. And they want their handheld. They don't know how to engage with the problem. But if you give them $100 on a Friday night and say, you've been here for a month, let's have beers and nibbles, and you can meet the team, they absolutely smash that problem. And it's completely unspecified other than the budget. Why can they engage with one unspecified problem but not another? And we decided that what's probably happening is we're teaching people that technology is fragile. You can break all sorts of things. You need to be taught how to use it. And you need to be taught the particular way to use it. And so they've kind of developed this learned helplessness where they're so afraid of getting it wrong or knowing that they want you to show you. They've worked out how to use the tool, but they have no knowledge of when and where you use the tool. And it's the when and where that are increasingly important. And we're not teaching that and we're not testing that. What we're testing is the how. And and if you go back to the consulting story of language models, what it's doing is compressing execution. Understanding intent and assuring quality are the really important things now. They're not the things that we're teaching. What we're teaching is execution.
So one really interesting thing that's emerging, particularly in the US, is very young children saying, why do I need to learn to read? Because they're interacting with tablets and, they're going, what use is it to me? And I will talk to it. I've kind of argued that we're about to move from the society of the text to the society of the voice, which is an interesting shift that I'm seeing emerging. And that's a whole different set of problems.
But is this the same as learning your number facts? So I've got a calculator. Why do I need to learn all this? And the answer is standing in front of it. You've gone to a restaurant and you've got the bill. Is it correct? Now you don't need to be able to like add it up perfectly, but you need to be able to look at the things and go,
yeah, that's kind of right. Or no, that's $1,000 more than I was expecting. So
yeah.
these are all the arguments, but the problem is that people are starting to have these things pop up and be quite confronted by a child going, "Why do I have to learn that?" And I once even used Pythagoras' theorem to solve an actual real life problem when I was in high school. And I was like one of the most rusted on people going, "Why do I learn mathematics? Because it's never going to be useful to me." But it helped me get something through a door once.
And it's. I think that's the thing. We've forgotten that we need to give people a reason to engage. I wrote a thing called First Words, where I was looking at it's notionally looking at this attention problem we supposedly have. Because I bumped across an essay somewhere that was talking about how there's. I think it's a bloke who he teaches literature in some university somewhere in the US, and all the advice has been you can't give the students difficult books. And this is tertiary. Because they can't read them. You've got to give them bits. And this is where all this research comes out, so they can only engage with small text or bits of text and all this other stuff. And he said stuff, for this year, I'm assigning these books. And he was just blatant up front. He said, this subject is going to cover these books and you will have to read them. And this is why. And they all read them and it wasn't a problem. And that's when you start realizing, so what's happened is there's so much stuff out there now. And so much of it is, again, as we said before, not particularly wonderful. The people look at it and go, "Why am I reading this? What's at the other end of this?" And we're not helping them. We're treating it as what we need to do is make it simpler so they do read it. Whereas what we should be doing is saying, well, there are reasons and we should be articulating them. We should be making it clear. What the bloke from the university did was he used authority. He said, well, if you want to pass this subject, you're going to have to, aren't you? But there's other ways of doing it. The next time you're reading an essay in one of the big mastheads, the Atlantic or something. Ever since I wrote First Words, I'm very much of this. A lot of the time, the first page is all throat clearing. There's no why I should read this. It's just all atmospheric, and you go,
It's so much rubbish, and I have no patience with that.
well, what? And I'm very much now, why am I reading this? And you go, if I'm asking this, why students? And so part of the problem is that the institutions and the people in the institutional authority are saying, why aren't you reading my stuff? And that's, well, because I got a page and didn't say anything.
Yeah.
So I think that it does kind of go back to the idea that if you want kids to learn how to read, you've got to show them why reading is important, and not theoretically. It needs to start from the bottom up and kind of material. This is how you're going to engage with the world, and let me show you examples of why it works, and let's make it useful for you now.
And I just remember, the amazing feeling when you read a really good book and you get that thrill of it catches you right away, and you get to the end and you feel really great, and you're like, oh, I wish I could capture that moment again. If I read it again, I won't have that same moment. Maybe we need to bottle that for the future of AI. But thanks very much for joining me for this chat. It was really interesting.
It's definitely a fascinating time. I'm very much in the middle path. You look at these, we're all going to be able to work because of AGI, and I can't see that happening.
I don't think
it's also it's not that nothing's going to change. It's very hard to see forward, but you can see the opportunities and where there are chances to do interesting stuff and to make a difference. I think that the real challenge is realizing that we're kind of at the end of one paradigm and we're starting to feel our way into the next one. And if anyone's on stage saying they're a futurist, saying they can tell you what the future looks like, they're wrong, because none of us know. It's more the challenge is to go back to your point. Then how do you do some sort of future sensing? But the first step is admitting that using data is backwards looking, projecting the future. And I think the other thing is acknowledging that you can't predict the future, but you can find the affordance and the opportunities in the present, and you can explore them and you can move forward. And so there is clearly direction. It's more about experimentation and finding our way forward than about executing on some grand vision.
Yeah, that's a really good point to end on. Thanks so much, Pete. That's been Pete Evans-Greenwood, and we're done. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Bye.